Bye weeks are back in week 9, and we have some stud wide receivers playing overseas. But most importantly, hit the like button if you're glad Josh McDaniels is no longer in Vegas. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone's doing well out there. Today we're talking about who we're starting and sitting for the wide receiver position in fantasy football here in week 9, but we're going to have a few weekly starters out on bye this week, right? So we have to try to find ourselves some solid replacements. We're not going to have the likes of Amon-Ra St. Brown, Brandon Aiyuk, Christian Kirk, Calvin Ridley, maybe even some of you who are using Courtland Sutton. Not going to be an option for you here this week, but I got some guys in today's show that I think could fill in just fine. But like I always do here on Wednesday, there's something I got to talk about for a quick second before we get into all the matchups. If that's all you care about, there are timestamps down below. But we're still trying our best to change the world and get some children sponsored and removed from extreme poverty. So far, year to date, we've had 7 children sponsored, which is great. Our goal is 58 children by Super Bowl 58. So we still have 51 more to go, and I need some of the help out there from you, Headliner Nation. There's a lot of children out there that we could really bless before the holiday season. So let's look at this week's Compassion Kid of the Week. Everyone out there say hello to little Pauline. She's only 1 year old. She lives in Uganda and has been looking for a sponsor for the last 303 days. Is anyone out there in Headliner Nation able to help change this little girl's life? If there is, I have a link for you down below in the description. It's www.compassion.com/headliners. Once you go onto that website, you'll be able to search for Pauline by her child ID number. It was right there on the screen. But maybe when you complete your search, it says that she's no longer available. Don't look at that as a disappointment. That is a great thing. That little girl is being taken care of. But there are a ton of other children on that site that we can help and make a difference with. I am still a firm believer that this community that we have built here can help change the world one child at a time. So please head over to www.compassion.com/headliners. There are links down below in the description. Now, I've asked for the last few weeks in these Wednesday videos, in my wide receiver videos, that if you've sponsored a child through Compassion before, to please leave a comment down below so other people can see some testimonials. Those comments are all over those other videos. If you still feel compelled to leave another comment to try to help out, I would greatly appreciate that as well. Thank you so much for that going forward. But I know this is not something a lot of people want to talk about. You click on a video to talk about football, but sometimes there's more to life than just football. And I'm really trying to change some lives this year, if we possibly can, for these young children that are just suffering from extreme poverty, right? Let's try to help them out the best we can. I know I get comments each and every week. Why not help out kids here in the US? We do that every single year. We're trying to change the world, no, not just change our country. And this is the next step in that to help really make a difference worldwide. So thank you so much for that time. But now let's go ahead and dive in to Thursday night football between the Tennessee Titans and Pittsburgh Steelers. And do we finally have a quarterback that can deliver deep, catchable balls down the field to DeAndre Hopkins with some consistency in Will Levis now in Tennessee? Because coming into week 8, DeAndre Hopkins hadn't found the end zone all year long. He left week 8 having 3 touchdowns. He also finished that game with over 100 yards receiving. He now has 2 100-yard receiving games over his last 3 games played. And there's really no other wide receiver on this team that's going to get consistent large volume. This is D-Hop's opportunity to rack up some receptions and score some fantasy points, especially in this matchup going up against Pittsburgh. They allow over 33 fantasy points per game. That is 4th most in the league to opposing wide receivers. There's a little bit of an issue, I guess we could say, though. Head coach Mike Vrabel is pretty much non-committal at this point when he was asked whether or not Will Levis was still going to start when Ryan Tannehill was healthy. Now, it doesn't look like Tanny's going to be healthy this week. He still hasn't practiced at the time of this recording, but that is definitely something to pay attention to once he does get back to full health. Now, this is also a Thursday night football game, and anybody who's watched me for any amount of time knows that I hate Thursday night football games when it comes to fantasy football. We can't expect the huge game like we saw in week 8 every week from DeAndre Hopkins going forward. He is still somewhat of a risky start because even in a huge game last week, he really didn't see a whole lot of volume, only 6 targets. It's not like the guy is going out each and every week and seeing 10 targets. Remember, in fantasy football, we're trying to find those guys with opportunity at scoring points. I mean, no one can see the future, right? But we're trying to project opportunity, and DeAndre Hopkins, hopefully he can start to get a little bit more of that here in the coming weeks. He's still going to be a Verge top 24 guy for me, though, in a good matchup. Now, for the Steelers, we got Diontae Johnson, we got George Pickens, but we also have what looks like a busted up quarterback this week in Kenny Pickett, who's already come out and said that he's going to play despite a rib injury. This guy has struggled to produce when he's fully healthy. He's missing wide open reads. I don't know if you saw the play last weekend. Diontae Johnson came off a perfect rub route. He was wide open right there in the end zone, and Pickett just looked away. And you can really see how that's happened a lot lately. The guy only has 1 passing touchdown over the last month of the season. Now in his second game back though, Diontae Johnson kind of retook that target hog role in this offense with 14 targets. But what's even more crazy than that, listen to this. Backup tight end Connor Hayward saw more targets than George Pickens. WTF. But there is going to be an opportunity to bounce back here this week going up against Tennessee. They allow 31.7 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. That is 7th most in the league. We know about Pickett's ribs. We know that Pat Freiermuth, he's still on the IR, and it was just announced that Minkah Fitzpatrick is going to be out for this game as well. It is apparent to everyone on earth, though, that they need to get the ball to George Pickens more. The guy only had 1 catch last week, and he turned it into a touchdown. We've already broken down earlier in the season that every single time this guy has seen 8+ targets, he gets over 100 receiving yards. It's not rocket science. Throw George Pickens the football. He's just a little bit more boom or bust, and as of right now, due to volume, Diontae Johnson just slightly safer. But now we're going to transition over into some Sunday football, but you can't sleep in. You got to wake up early. The Miami Dolphins and Kansas City Chiefs are going to be in Germany 9:30 a.m. Eastern time, so you got to wake up early. Now, typically when we see these international games, there's not a lot of offense. How do you remedy that? Well, hopefully by sending some of the better offenses in the NFL. We'll start it off with the Miami Dolphins, Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. And now through 8 weeks of the season, Tyreek Hill is sitting at 1,014 receiving yards, well en route to his 2,000-yard preseason goal that he set for himself. The dude cannot be stopped. Plus, he's also on a career-high pace for receiving touchdowns. 8 touchdowns through 8 games, has a touchdown in every game except for 1 game all year long. But now all of a sudden, Jalen Waddle starting to heat up as well a little bit. Touchdowns now in 3 of his last 4 games played. Just had his first 100-yard game of the season and has also seen at least 9 targets now in 3 of his last 4 games played. He's starting to slowly catch up to his 2022 pace. Now a matchup going up against Kansas City. It's not going to be easy, right? They allow only 24.2 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. That is 7th fewest in the league. But they have faced that Broncos offense here 2 of the last 3 games. So definitely those numbers could be skewed slightly. There's no other major injuries here in Miami. Now, like I said at the beginning, international games kind of have that tendency to suck a little bit. But an offense like the Miami Dolphins definitely has the ability to overcome any obstacles, including these international games. I said it in the quarterback video. I'm going to say it right here in the wide receiver video. Don't get cute with pieces of the Miami Dolphins offense. I don't care if it's Tua, Tyreek, or Jalen Waddle. If they're healthy, they're in your lineup each and every week. For the Kansas City Chiefs, really can't say the same thing, right? At least Rashee Rice was once again the leader in receiving among all wide receivers in Kansas City last week. The problem was it was only 4 catches for 56 yards. The Kansas City offense just can't seem to figure out that Denver defense. However, Rashee Rice continues to be the clear leader in targets on this offense. He has had at least 10 targets more than any other wide receiver on the roster in Kansas City here to start the season. He is by far the safest option in this passing offense, not named Travis Kelce. but I highly doubt T-Swizzle goes to Germany, which means this could be another Rashee Rice game. Going against Miami, they allow over 30.5 fantasy points per game. That's 10th most in the NFL. Now, they did just get back Jalen Ramsey last week, so that's definitely something to make a note of, but there's no other new injuries here either. But Rashee Rice really needs to be the only wide receiver we consider in this offense as of right now. He has seen over 100 snaps out of the slot, and you know we love them slot snaps around here. Hopefully, they can continue to feed him a little bit more volume in this game. If Miami can put up some points early, we could be in for a decent day from Rashee Rice if they have to throw all 4 quarters here in Germany. Honestly, like I said, the only option worth noting in Kansas City, unless you're into that sub-5 fantasy point type lifestyle. But all right, now we can go to the afternoon games. The first one up, the Minnesota Vikings, Atlanta Falcons. And for Minnesota, just as Jordan Addison was heating up, mother effer, we just lost Kirk Cousins, and now all of a sudden we have to go to rookie 5th-round quarterback Jaren Hall out of BYU. Most people out there watching this video right now are Googling who the hell is Jaren Hall. And I'm not going to sit here and write the kid off before he plays a football game, but you have to think that this is a huge loss of value to Jordan Addison. Kirk Cousins was playing really well. Jordan Addison had touchdowns in 6 of the 8 ball games this year, and just over the last 2 games combined, 14 receptions for 205 yards and 3 touchdowns. I don't think we're going to see similar numbers with Jaren Hall. I can see some similar volume, right? The volume is going to be there, but is the touchdown upside going to remain? That's really where Kirk gave him that added value. Now they're going up against Atlanta, who's been solid for most of the year, despite last week being absolutely torched by Will Levis and DeAndre Hopkins. However, on the season, they're allowing 26.2 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but I just can't help but think, is this the last time we've seen Kirk Cousins play for the Minnesota Vikings? I know there are a lot of people out there that wanted Kirk gone, and now I have a feeling you may be regretting it just a little bit now that he is, in fact, gone. Now, yesterday, we all know that Minnesota made a trade with the Arizona Cardinals. They brought over Josh Dobbs. It's going to be a backup situation, at least for this first week for Josh Dobbs. They're going to give Jaren Hall a chance. However, if he struggles, he can't get the job done, we could be seeing Dobbs in the very near future, and I have to think that would benefit Jordan Addison the most. We saw Josh Dobbs continually feed Marquise Hollywood Brown in Arizona. You have to think we see something similar in Minnesota with Jordan Addison. All right, their opponents at Atlanta. And really, it's only Drake London that's worth talking about. And as if this passing offense needed even more controversy, now we don't even know who the quarterback is going to be. Is it Desmond Ridder? Is it Taylor Heineke? Thanks to Arthur Smith. Damn, my daddy has a ton of money, but yet I still wear medium-sized t-shirt, waist of a head coach. Sorry. I know that I was supposed to say that on the inside. It came out, but I'm not going to edit it out because that dude drives me absolutely crazy. But as we know, we could sit here and talk about everything that Drake London has done or what he could do, but really the only thing that matters is the groin injury that he suffered in Week 8. It is still unclear whether or not he's going to even play in this ball game here in Week 9. In a matchup going up against Minnesota, on paper, it's not bad. They allow over 32 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but that defense has been playing a little bit better here as of late. So between the injury to Drake London himself, not knowing who the quarterback is going to be, you have to assume that there is a lot of risk surrounding Drake London here in Week 9. He's not going to be somebody who's going to be very high in my rankings. He may not even make it inside my top 30. Best case scenario is by the end of the week, he's 100% full go in practice, and honestly, Taylor Heineke's named the starting quarterback. But now we're going to head out to Baltimore for the Ravens and the Seattle Seahawks. We'll kick it off with Seattle. And if DK Metcalf and Geno Smith could just get on the same page, DK Metcalf may be a top 5 fantasy wide receiver. He had another game in Week 8 with 14 targets. However, only brought in 5 catches for 67 yards. In fact, he's only got 69.7% catchable targets so far this season. That's good enough to rank as wide receiver 58. DK needs more catchable balls in Seattle. Meanwhile, Tyler Lockett's bringing in a bigger percentage of his targets. He's just not really going anywhere with it, averaging his lowest yards per per reception of his career. Now, JSN, a little bit lower on the volume, but does have touchdowns now in back-to-back ball games. But now they get a matchup this week going up against Baltimore. They allow 23.8 fantasy points per game, 6th fewest in the NFL, and they've had 9 takeaways on defense in the last 5 games they've played. Now, there's no new injuries here in Seattle, but we know that Seattle's going to have to throw the ball if they want to win this game here this weekend. The problem we have is the amount of guys they have that they can throw the ball to. DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, Jackson Smith and Jigba, and don't forget about Jake motherfucking Bobo out there, because you know he can always catch the sporadic touchdown as well. The problem is there may not be a whole lot of touchdowns to go around against this defense. If I had to choose one guy, I'm still chasing the volume and hoping for the connection with DK Metcalf. Their opponent in Baltimore, it's really Zay Flowers, and once again he did exactly what I expected him to do last week. He led the team in targets, he led the team in receptions. Just didn't go anywhere with it. The guy had 7 targets, 5 receptions, and 19 receiving yards. How are you going to go out there and average 3.8 yards per reception as a wide receiver? But we also got to see some visible frustration from Odell Beckham Jr., who didn't even record a catch in Week 8 despite getting 4 targets himself. That wheel is going to get greased at some point soon here. I can tell that Lamar Jackson is going to take care of him in the very near future. Now they get a matchup going up against Seattle. This could be the matchup right here because they allow over 31 fantasy points per game, 8th most in the league. Another team not really dealing with any new injuries, and an Odell Beckham touchdown, it could be coming this week. The problem is the dude is so boom or bust and his floor is so low, he's almost not even worth throwing into your lineup due to the amount of risk that he has. Zay Flowers is still going to be the more consistent option week in and week out, and he will be the guy that's the highest in my top 30 overall rankings in this matchup. Which will then take us out to Cleveland for the Browns and the Cardinals. And after the trade of Josh Dobbs to the Minnesota Vikings, and without the return of Kyler Murray, that's going to make the start super tough of Marquise Hollywood Brown, because now he's going to have to go on the road to Cleveland against one of the best defenses in all of the NFL and be reliant upon rookie 5th-round quarterback Clayton Tune in his very first ever NFL start. Now, Marquise Hollywood Brown himself has only gone over 61 yards receiving one time all year, and for the most part has really remained super heavily touchdown dependent. But if we're touchdown dependent, how many touchdowns can we really rely upon in this matchup? Cleveland only allows 23.2 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. That's 4th fewest in the league. We could definitely see Kyler back after this week, and that'll definitely give a boost to Hollywood Brown. But as of right now, we're going to need one big play, one busted coverage, one fallen defender, one big touchdown in order to make Marquise Hollywood Brown worth the start. That's a lot of risk put into one player here in Week 9. Now, I'm not saying he can't do it, but honestly, with the amount of risk involved there, there's probably a few other safer options that I would rather turn to. One of those options maybe be somebody he plays in this game, Amari Cooper. Cooper is definitely somebody who I feel a little bit safer about here in Week 9. Now, despite having 2 really bad games in October, he still has scored over 10 fantasy points now in 4 of his last 6 games played. He also continues to see the best volume on the team, 8+ targets in 5 of the last 7 games he's played. Also really kind of has to help him a little bit. They just chose to deal Donovan Peoples-Jones. He's no longer in town. That doesn't free up a lot of volume, but a couple targets a week at least. Now a matchup going up against Arizona. They allow over 30 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. That is 11th most in the NFL. We still have no idea when Deshaun Watson is going to come back, if he's going to come back. When he comes back, is he even healthy? There's a lot of questions there still, but PJ Walker has shown for the most part to continually feed Amari Cooper. Given this matchup, this good matchup going up against Arizona, Amari Cooper is kind of going to remain right there in that mid to low end wide receiver 2/flex play range for me here this week. If he can get 8+ targets in this matchup, I think a lot of people are going to be happy with the production that he has. That'll take us up to Green Bay for the Packers and the Rams. We'll kick it off here with Los Angeles, because the worst case scenario for both Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua would be an injury to Matthew Stafford. Well, we have an injury to Matthew Stafford, and it may not be a good one. He suffered a UCL sprain in his right thumb. Yeah, on his throwing hand. That is not ideal. Now, he is currently considered day-to-day, but the Rams are scrambling to find another quarterback to add to their roster just in case, because honestly, there's a good chance that we do not have Matthew Stafford this week. Plus, we've already seen an inconsistent Puka and Kupp over the last couple weeks, but now they get a matchup against Green Bay on the road in Green Bay, and they only allow 26 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, which is 11th fewest in the league. Let us not also forget, though, that Puka himself had some knee swelling after the Week 8 game against Dallas. He currently is questionable himself. This one really ultimately comes down to Matthew Stafford, though, and I think that we all know that. Because if we have some emergency quarterback on the road in Green Bay in a tough matchup, it could get super ugly for both of these wide receivers. As of right now, I do feel slightly safer with Kupp over Puka due to the potential knee injury that he's working himself through. For Green Bay, I think people are starting to realize that Aaron Rodgers really covered up a lot of the inadequacies of this offense for quite some time, because right now it is mind-blowingly bad in Green Bay. Christian Watson hasn't had over 3 receptions in a game yet this season. That's stupid. Romeo Doubs sees decent volume, but doesn't have over 30 yards receiving in a game since week 4. Stupid. I mean, he's been saved with touchdowns now in back-to-back weeks and is basically enough to salvage his fantasy day. Now, Jaden Reed, on the other hand, had a solid week 8 for sure, but the 2 games prior had 28 total yards receiving. Now, in this matchup going up against Los Angeles, they allow only 25.7 fantasy points per game. That is 9th fewest in the league. However, we did just see CeeDee Lamb and the Dallas Cowboys absolutely destroy this team in Week 8. The offensive line is still hurting in Green Bay. We know that the run game is struggling, but they need to really get this passing game going. The problem is Jordan Love has yet to throw for multiple touchdowns in a home game at Green Bay yet this year. We know that the yardage totals have been low for these wide receivers for multiple weeks. The inconsistent volume is still there. The way that this defense in Green Bay struggles to stop the run may really hurt these wide receivers the most. Think of it this way. If we don't have Matthew Stafford, we have some emergency quarterback, you have to think that Los Angeles is going to want to run the ball a lot. Green Bay struggles against the run. That's going to keep the clock moving. It's going to limit possessions and could definitely hurt the overall ceiling of the Green Bay wide receivers. Both of these guys, more than likely, going to be outside my top 30 rankings this week. Which is going to take us out to Houston for the Texans and Tampa Bay, and we'll kick it off with Tampa Bay because I could almost feel the collective sphincter release when Mike Evans scored that late touchdown in Week 8. So many people thought they were going to have a crappy outing from Mike Evans, and in one play, turned it around a little bit, gave him 11 fantasy points on the day. Definitely could have been a lot worse. He has now had at least double-digit fantasy points and a touchdown in 5 of the 7 games this season, and he's all the way up to wide receiver 13. As for Chris Godwin, he's starting to become more of a weekly option as the season progresses. He's averaging 9 targets and just under 13 fantasy points per game over his last 4 games of the season. His yardage total still a little bit low, but it's good to see the targets there, right? Because at least it gives him an opportunity to score us those fantasy points. Now they get a matchup going up against Houston. They allow only 22.8 fantasy points per game. That is 3rd fewest in the league. However, this defense has allowed over 341 yards passing in 2 of its last 3 games. Plus, this run D has been playing great football. We already know that Tampa Bay struggles to run on the ground. It's only going to have to lead to more passing, which is great for Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. No other new injuries in Tampa Bay, but Evans is in a spot where it's almost too much of a risk to not start him, right? The touchdowns are just there too frequently. As for Godwin, he's a little bit more of a safer wide receiver 3 or flex option at best. It is definitely good, though, to see Baker Mayfield feeding both of these guys here in consistent weeks. What about for Houston? And for Nico Collins, if it wasn't for a defender inadvertently tripping him, Nico would have had a huge touchdown play in week 8. I saw it with my own eyes. I was there at the game. Had he caught that ball, he would currently be a top 12 overall wide receiver in fantasy football. The guy just continues to get open. He continues to get deep looks down the field. He's averaging 17.5 yards per reception. We don't need huge volume. We need a couple big plays each week. Plus, he's had some tough matchups here over the last few weeks, so let's not forget about that. It was also good, though, to see Tank Dell return to this lineup, even though he really didn't do much of anything. He also, though, just barely missed on a deep ball from CJ Stroud, just barely missed his outstretched hands. He's going to be a little bit more boom or bust, though, each week. What I don't like from Tank Dell, I know some people may not agree with this. I don't like him doing punt returns because after he returns that punt, if he takes a big hit, he doesn't come right back out on the field. I want that guy on the field as much as I possibly can. Punt returns kind of take away from that sometimes, and I'm not a huge fan of that, but I understand why they do it. The kid is absolutely electric. But now a matchup going up against Tampa Bay. They allow 31.2 fantasy points per game. That's 9th most in the league. We know that Robert Woods is still banged up. He may not play, along with almost the entire offensive line. They can't run the ball overly successful in Houston because they have no one to run block. It means they need to continue to throw the ball, and I expect them to do that here this week. This may be one of the better matchups that these wide receivers have had over the last couple weeks. Now, due to the lack of production, I know there's going to be some added risk with both of these guys. However, I don't hate starting Nico Collins as a wide receiver 2 and Tank Dell more of a fringe wide receiver 3. Which will now take us up to New England for the Patriots and the Washington Commandos. And the Terry McLaurin that we expected to see at the start of the season is finally starting to get going. He now has at least 11 fantasy points in 4 of his last 5 games played, at least 9 targets in 3 straight ball games, and there's still plenty of meat on the bone. He's only caught 17 out of 32 targets over the last 3 games. That's potential for some big games right there that we just haven't seen yet. And honestly, that right there is enough to keep me excited for Terry McLaurin. It was also great to see that they had Jahan Dotson on the roster this past week. 10 targets, 8 receptions, 108 yards, and a touchdown. By far, not even close, his best game of the season. But now they get a matchup going up against New England. They allow 29.6 fantasy points per game, which is 12th most in the league. Curtis Samuel is currently questionable, and just when you think this defense couldn't get any worse, they've traded away their top 2 pass rushers in Montez Sweat and Chase Young. This defense isn't going to be able to stop anyone, which is going to force Washington to have to throw the ball each and every week. The biggest downfall here, though, it's that New England offense. I don't know if they can go out there and score enough to keep Washington throwing all 4 quarters, right? Can Mac Jones and that island of misfit toys that he has for wide receivers put some points on the board? Because if they can, we're in line for another solid day for both of these guys. We really need to see more consistency before we want to trust Jahan Dotson. He's had 1 game, right? But Terry McLaurin is still the guy who's been a lot more consistent that we trust in our fantasy lineups. He'll be my highest ranked one here this week. Now, for New England, they just lost their top wide receiver. Kendrick Bourne tore his ACL in week 8, and he is done for the year. He was the only wide receiver on this team worth a fantasy crap, and like I just mentioned, they're like the island of misfit toys now. It's like a bunch of random pieces that haven't really done anything forever. No wide receiver on this team is averaging over 5 fantasy points per game now. Do we really want to consider starting Demario Douglas or Juju Smith-Schuster here this week in week 9 of fantasy football? You have to think there's a lot better options out there at your disposal. Now, this could be an opportunity for Juju to start to gain some momentum second half of the season, but we need to see that before we trust it. But this matchup is just so good. Washington allows almost 36 fantasy points per game, 2nd most in the league. Devontae Parker, he's still in the concussion protocol. We don't know if he's going to be active this week or not, so there is no way of knowing where this offense is going to turn. If anything, I hope it really turns to Ramondre Stevenson and he can have himself a huge second half of the season. But as for the wide receivers here, I'm not starting any of them. But now we'll head out to New Orleans for the Saints and the Bears. We'll kick it off with DJ Moore because right now he is trying like hell to do the most that he can with the little amount that he's getting each and every week. With Justin Fields under center, DJ Moore had an average depth of target of 12 yards down the field. With Tyler Bagent, he's got an average depth of target of only 5 yards down the field. He's overly reliant on only yards after the catch, which is great because he's awesome at that. We've talked about that in the past, and you can see him trying to fight through tackles each and every time the ball gets in his hands. He actually averaged 9 yards after the catch per reception in week 8. That's the second highest total he's had in a game yet this season, but now a matchup going up against New Orleans. They allowed 26.5 fantasy points per game, right around league average. No other new injuries in Chicago, but we can't just look at DJ Moore as someone who's unstartable right now. The big plays that he can make happen, he can do it with any quarterback. Like I said, he overly excels at yards after the catch. The problem is, a lot of fantasy owners, myself included, getting a little bit antsy, right? So I look at it this way. He's a little bit more of a flex play at best right now without Justin Fields. When does Fields come back? We really don't know. But as of right now, in the immediate future, I think we're going to have to live with this little dink and dunk style offense and just hope that DJ Moore can break a big one. How about for the New Orleans Saints? And as the weeks go on, I'm starting to come to a little bit of a realization here. If you've been here for any length of time, you know we spent a lot of time this offseason talking about the potential opportunity for big plays in the New Orleans Saints passing offense ever since they acquired Derek Carr. Now, with a lot of those big plays, I think a lot of people, myself included, expected Chris Olave to be on the receiving end of most of them, right? That wasn't the game of Michael Thomas. But as the weeks go on, I'm starting to think they're being taken away by Rashid Shaheed. This guy is like a clone of Gabe Davis in Buffalo. No, not size and speed style-wise. No, I'm talking about boom or bust-wise. Because he's not out there dominating the target share. Both Michael Thomas and Chris Olave get more volume each and every game than Rashid Shaheed. In fact, Olave, he's had 10 plus targets in 5 of the 8 games this season. They're just not down the field. They're more so moving the chains like Michael Thomas does. Olave only has 11 points more on the season than Michael Thomas does. But what's even crazier is Rashid Shaheed has more points than both of them. But if you really go through and look at the numbers, you'll see that the bulk of those points by Rashid Shaheed were scored in only 3 games all season long. How can you rely on starting a guy that's going to fail more than 50% of the time in your fantasy lineup? Well, now they get a matchup going up against Chicago. They allow 29.3 fantasy points per game. There's no new injuries there for the New Orleans Saints. It's just really difficult with this offense to know where the big plays are going to go. We know that Rashid Shaheed is never going to be the target leader in this offense. As of right now, the bulk of the volume is still going the way of Chris Olave at the wide receiver position. Outside of that, we know it's still going to Alvin Kamara. But when we look at Chris Olave, maybe instead of looking at him as more of a top 12 or 15 option, we need to start being a little bit more realistic and calling him more of maybe a top 25 option at best. Now, as much as that pains my heart to say, we got to be honest about it, right? Because some of these big plays that Shaheed is getting, we were expecting Chris Olave to walk away with. So in this week, in this matchup, we really have to say the same thing every week about Shaheed, right? He's literally like Gabe Davis. He's a 50-50 chance that he's going to go the hell off or he's going to absolutely tank your fantasy team. If it's me and my fantasy team, I'm always going to chase the volume first, and I'm still going to have Chris Olave as the highest ranked wide receiver here in New Orleans. But now let's head down to Carolina for a matchup between the Indianapolis Colts and Carolina Panthers. We'll start off in Indianapolis, and the Michael Pittman, Gardner Minshew connection is in full force right now. Back-to-back tough matchups against Cleveland and New Orleans, yet Michael Pittman scored over 14 fantasy points in each one of them. He has also 8+ receptions in 5 of the 8 games this season. He's had 13 or more targets in 2 of his last 3 ball games, but we also can't overlook the production of his teammate Josh Downs here either. He's scored at least 10 fantasy points in 4 straight ball games and is all the way up to wide receiver 31 overall. Both of these guys are heavily used each week. Now they get a matchup going up against Carolina. They allow 24.9 fantasy points per game, 8th fewest in the league, and they really limited CJ Stroud and that Texans offense just last week. Kind of crazy how similar Nico Collins and Tank Dell are to Michael Pittman and Josh Downs. We know Carolina is capable of shutting down a mixture of wide receivers like this. There is no denying that this is a tough matchup for these guys, no, but we've seen them produce in tough matchups all season long. As of right now, I still feel slightly safer about Michael Pittman than I do Josh Downs, but both of them are going to be inside my top 30 more than likely. How about for Carolina? It's Adam Thielen. He just had his worst week of the season since week 1. He still scored 11.2 fantasy points for you, though. He's the current wide receiver 8 overall, has had 11 or more targets in 4 of his last 5 ball games, touchdowns in 2 of his last 3, and he's on pace for a career high in receiving yards. And so many people wrote off this old man. That's what you get right there. That's experience right here. He's both the safety outlet and the deep threat for Bryce Young. By far, the most consistent option in this offense. He already has more receiving yards this season in 7 games than he did in all of 2022 or in 2021. Now a matchup going up against Indianapolis, they allow 29.1 fantasy points per game. No other wide receiver in Carolina has over 20 receptions this season. Adam Thielen has 57. That's enough for you to know that he's the number 1 option in Carolina and the only fantasy relevant wide receiver that we're starting there each and every week. That'll take us back out to the desert, though, for the Las Vegas Raiders and New York Giants. We'll start it off with New York because it sounds like we could be getting back Daniel Jones at quarterback for the Giants this week. Thank God, and who cares, all at the same time. This offense is so bad. The lowest scoring team in the NFL. The worst passing team in the NFL. No wide receivers on this team are averaging over 33 receiving yards per game. And here's a crazy stat for you. On the entire season, Giants wide receivers have a total of 1 touchdown. Their highest scoring wide receiver right now is Wan'Dale Robinson. He's only averaging 5.1 fantasy points per game. Now they have a matchup going up against Las Vegas. They allow 23.7 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. That is 5th fewest in the league. And let's just hope that they can keep Max Crosby off of Daniel Jones long enough for him to stay healthy. Yeah, I know it's probably not going to happen. We also know that Darren Waller, he's dealing with a hamstring injury. Tyrod Taylor has a rib injury, and the entire offensive line in New York is held together by Flex Seal at this point. I really hope this offense can figure it out at some point, but I got to see it before I want to start any wide receiver in New York. But I would be lying if I didn't think you couldn't see the happiness in my face when we're going to talk about the Raiders here, because while we were sleeping, Josh McDaniels lost his job. I think a lot of people are a little bit excited about that. Now, no, I'm not rooting for another man to lose his job. He's about to make millions of dollars for doing absolutely nothing for the next few years. I think he's okay. But now we have new interim head coach Antonio Pierce. If that name sounds familiar, it's because he's a former player. And I absolutely love that for the Las Vegas Raiders. There are a lot of players probably right now in that locker room that are disgruntled, I guess you could say. No one is going to be able to relate to them any better than a guy that's been in that position before, a former player. But I'm glad this move happened because I was starting to get super worried about Davante Adams and Jakobi Meyers' rest of season. What we just saw from this offense, if that's what you want to call it, in Las Vegas in Week 8 may be the worst football I have watched all season long, considering the weapons they have on the field, right? Davante Adams hasn't finished inside the top 30 wide receivers in any of his last 4 games played. He's also scored single-digit points now in 4 straight ball games. Jakobi Meyers, he just went the entire damn game in Week 8 and only got 1 target. Jimmy G looked horrible. Now their next matchup is going up against the New York Giants. They allow 28.3 fantasy points per game, a middle-of-the-pack defense, and it's the former team of new interim head coach Antonio Pierce, kind of adding to the storyline here a little bit. Now with this change in coaching, do we see a change at quarterback? Honestly, I kind of feel like they have to. I feel like they need to give Aiden O'Connell a chance to see, can he be the future or not? We tried to tell people all offseason that Jimmy G just ain't going to be it for Davante Adams. Sure, he'll be serviceable, but he's not going to be at the upper echelon like he has been for years with Jimmy G, and people were finally starting to see it. Now, obviously, for the next few weeks, there's going to be a lot of unknowns in this offense, but there's nowhere to go but up. I do feel like the quickest way to right the ship on offense anyway is to force feed your playmakers the football. So I definitely expect an increase in targets going the way of Davante Adams and Jakobi Meyers, trying to be a little bit more creative with Josh Jacobs as well. And don't even get me started on rookie tight end Michael Mayer, who's out there making big plays all the time, just doesn't see consistent volume either. Now, no, this isn't going to be the Miami Dolphins offense by any means, but it's definitely a step in the right direction. These two will have a little bit of risk here this week, but if there's ever going to be an emotional bounce back, it's probably going to be right here in week 9. But now it's time to head out to Philadelphia for the Eagles and the Cowboys, my Manscaped matchup of the week. And this one just made sense. The top 2 wide receivers in this matchup get delivered clean balls each and every week, and now it's time for you to get yours as well. They just came out with a new product, the Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra. It's all the great goodness of the normal lawnmower, but now there's this foil shaver attachment that helps you get skin close. But maybe you're looking for other things. Don't worry, the holiday season is right around the corner, and there is a ton of stuff available on manscaped.com to help you fill those Christmas stockings. Whether it's body wash, shampoo, deodorant, lip balm, they have you covered. Just please do me a huge favor. Don't go pay full price. Use the promo code HEADLINERS at checkout for 20% off and free shipping. And we'll go ahead and kick it off right here with Dallas. And ever since we heard the frustrations of CeeDee Lamb about 2 weeks ago, he has gone the hell off. Back-to-back games, over 100 yards receiving, 19 receptions over the last 2 games, and 275 yards receiving in those 2 games combined. No other wide receiver in Dallas is getting enough volume to even be considered outside of CeeDee Lamb at this point, and they're going to have to continue to throw the ball through the air. This offensive line is beyond hurt at this point. They can't get the running game going, so definitely going to have to feed CeeDee Lamb. And what a better chance to do it this week against the Philadelphia Eagles. They allow 37.5 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. That is the most in the NFL. With the current run that CeeDee Lamb is on, in a great matchup going up against Philadelphia, he's probably going to be one of my higher ranked wide receivers here in week 9 and a definite must start in fantasy football. For Philadelphia, this matchup may not be as great for the wide receivers of Philly as it is for Dallas, right? But what A.J. Brown is doing right now is just straight bonkers. He's the overall wide receiver 2 in fantasy football. He just became the first player in NFL history with 6 straight games over 125 yards receiving. Now, Devontae Smith himself, he's coming off his best game since week 2 as well. They both capitalized off a great matchup last week against that horrible Washington defense. I'm really hoping that Devontae Smith can regain some of that consistency, because one good game, one bounce back game isn't enough for me to make him some must start. What I find absolutely crazy is I happened to check the consensus rankings earlier today, and one game from Devontae Smith, he's right back up inside the top 12. Don't overreact to one game. What we really look for here in fantasy football is playing the odds, right? The consistency. How often are these guys finishing high at their positions? That's where we're really trying to nail down the best starts of the week. But I just can't justify putting him that high, especially in this matchup going up against Dallas. They allow only 21.8 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. That is second fewest in the NFL. Now, A.J. Brown has basically joined like Tyreek Hill status at this point. As long as he's healthy, he's in your lineup. You never sit him. Smith, though, I'm going to be a little bit more cautious with. He worries me just a little bit more. When I look at Devontae Smith this week, I look at him as more of a low-end wide receiver too. Maybe a top 24 guy, but not a top 12 guy. I need to see it more consistently before I can shoot him that high up the rankings. Which will now take us to Sunday Night Football. The Buffalo Bills at the Cincinnati Bengals will kick it off in Buffalo, and Stephon Diggs is about as must-start as it gets, right? He's the current wide receiver 3 overall, averaging 17.6 fantasy points per game, and hasn't seen less than 11 targets in a game since week 4. As for Gabe Davis, he is what he is, right? His consistency rating that you see right here on the screen says it all. 50%. He's totally 100% boom or bust. You either commit to starting him or don't even own him, because he does nothing but cause you headaches when you don't start him, and he does go off. Think about this. Week 8, he went off, right? In the 2 games prior to week 8, he only scored 1 fantasy point in each game. Do you want to start someone who scores 1 fantasy point in your lineup? No, probably not. just completely boom or bust. Now a matchup going up against Cincinnati. They allow 26.1 fantasy points per game. There's no new injuries in Buffalo outside of their defense being totally banged up. But like I said, we know that Diggs is a must start. As for Gabe Davis, how lucky are you feeling? Like 1 point lucky or like 20 point lucky? But I got to admit something here. I kind of feel like this is a Gabe Davis touchdown kind of week. It's just a big risk. All right, but now let's go down to Cincinnati because, man, I absolutely love having a healthy Joe Burrow back. When he's dealing on the football field, it's making our fantasy lineups look that much better. Right now, Jamar Chase has basically re-entered auto start territory right after a rocky start to the season. He does now have 3 straight games of over 12 targets in each game and has double-digit receptions in 3 of the last 5 games he's played. Now we need to get T. Higgins going, though, as well. He did just have his best game last week since week 2. We got to remember that this guy dealt with a rib injury earlier in the season, and he still may not be 100% healthy. I am not writing him off rest of year, especially now that we have a healthy Joe Burrow. It may just take him a little bit of time to go back to what we were used to maybe in years past. But now a matchup going up against Buffalo, and they allow 26.8 fantasy points per game, but even Baker Mayfield was able to find the end zone a couple times last week against this defense. Chase, we know he's a top 12 guy each and every week. T. Higgins, probably going to be a Verge top 30 guy for me here this week. This Buffalo defense being as injured as it is and a healthy Joe Burrow gives us the opportunity, though, for both of these guys to have decent games. And that'll take us to Monday Night Football, a matchup with the Los Angeles Chargers and New York Jets. And I gotta be honest with you here, there's only 2 guys that I'm looking at in this matchup overall. For LA, it's going to be Keenan Allen, obviously. He's the wide receiver 5 overall in fantasy football, averaging just over 17 points per game, and it's all about them slot snaps. We don't need to worry about Sauce Gardner when our wide receiver lines up in the slot as much as Keenan Allen does. He has 223 slot snaps on the season. That's 5th highest in the NFL. By keeping him in the slot, we should have plenty of opportunities for him to rack up targets once again. Because when you're going up against the Jets, they don't allow a whole lot of points to opposing wide receivers. In fact, only 16.5 on the season. That is the lowest in the NFL. But that number is going to be slightly skewed. Last week, they went up against the Giants, Tommy DeVito at quarterback, and they only allowed a total of -9 yards passing. I have never seen anything like that before, so that greatly skews those numbers just a little bit. When it comes to injuries in LA, we have a couple as well. Gerald Everett still banged up. And what about Josh Palmer? We saw him come out of the game numerous times in week 8, limping, dealing with a knee injury, trying to gut it out. He is not 100% healthy. Now, I don't know if I want to sit here and say I expect an explosion game from Keenan Allen, but with all the work that he gets out of the slot and the current role he has in this offense, I have no issue starting him here this week. For the Jets, it's really only Garrett Wilson, right? He's the only guy worth mentioning in New York each and every week. 12 plus targets now in 3 of the last 4 games played, 7 plus receptions in 3 of his last 4 games played, and he just had his very first 100-yard receiving game of the season. The next closest wide receiver on this roster in targets is Allen Lazard, and he's almost 40 targets behind Garrett Wilson. He's truly the only option in this offense aside from the running game. Now, when we talk about the LA Chargers, they allow a whole lot of points to wide receivers, 34.4 fantasy points per game, 3rd most in the league. We know this offensive line continues to be in shambles, and we know that Garrett Wilson's going to be the man once again this week. This is one of those opportunities where we have to take advantage of it. There have been very few opportunities here in 2023 to really throw Garrett Wilson into our lineup and feel good about it. This one right here in week 9 has me feeling pretty good. All right, that's going to do it here for my wide receiver start and sit video for week 9 fantasy football. Hopefully I was able to give you a little bit of information to make some of your decisions a little bit easier, but don't forget, maybe you have a lot of options to consider here this week. Our rankings video will be out Thursday morning to help you make any of those final tough lineup decisions. But now is the time we all try to make that run in the second half of the fantasy football season and try to get into the playoffs, because once you get in the playoffs, anything can happen. I'm going to go ahead and get out of here for the day, though. Hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day, and then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.